Welcome to the Sleep Scholar. Tonight, we'll explore a quiet corner of history together. Settle in, close your eyes, and let these gentle facts carry you into deep sleep. In the year 1837, as Queen Victoria ascended to the throne of the United Kingdom, the Thames River that wound its way through London carried with it the detritus of centuries of human habitation. The great tidal river, rising and falling twice daily with the pull of the moon, regularly exposed vast stretches of mud along its banks, creating what historians now recognize as one of the most significant archaeological sites in Victorian England. It was within these muddy foreshore areas that a particular class of urban scavenger emerged, known colloquially as mudlarks, whose daily activities would provide both sustenance for the desperately poor and, unknowingly, a form of primitive archaeological recovery that preserved countless artifacts from London's past. The term mudlark itself appears to have originated in the early decades of the 19th century, though records indicate that the practice of scavenging along the Thames foreshore extends back considerably further. Historians believe the word derived from the muddy appearance of those who engaged in this activity, combined with the playful, almost bird-like manner in which they would hop and dart across the exposed riverbed in search of valuable items. The Victorian era, spanning from 1837 to 1901, represents the period during which mudlarking reached its most systematic and widespread practice, driven largely by the extreme poverty that characterized much of London's working-class population. To understand the context in which mudlarking flourished, one must first appreciate the condition of the Thames during the Victorian period. The river served simultaneously as London's primary source of drinking water, its main sewage disposal system, and its principal commercial highway. Ships from across the British Empire docked at wharves along the Thames, depositing goods and passengers, while simultaneously discarding unwanted materials into the murky waters. The construction of the London docks, completed in 1805, and the subsequent development of the West India docks and Surrey commercial docks created an increasingly busy waterway where valuable items regularly found their way into the river through accident, carelessness, or deliberate disposal. The tidal nature of the Thames proved crucial to their mudlarking enterprise. Twice daily, the river would recede, revealing extensive mudflats that stretched for hundreds of yards from the normal shoreline. These exposed areas, technically known as the foreshore, contained accumulated sediments that had built up over centuries. Archaeological evidence suggests that these mudflats preserved organic materials remarkably well due to the anaerobic conditions created by the fine Thames mud, which prevented decay and maintained artifacts in conditions that would have been impossible on dry land. Contemporary accounts from the 1840s and 1850s describe mudlarks as consisting primarily of elderly women, young children, and disabled men who were unable to secure more conventional forms of employment. Henry Mayhew, in his comprehensive study London Labour and the London Poor, published in 1851, provides one of the most detailed contemporary descriptions of mudlarking practices. According to Mayhew's observations, mudlarks typically began their work before dawn, timing their activities to coincide with low tide when the maximum area of foreshore became accessible. The social composition of the mudlarking community reflects the harsh realities of Victorian poverty. Records indicate that many mudlarks lived in the overcrowded tenements and lodging houses of areas such as Wapping, Rotherhithe, and Bermondsey, districts that bordered the Thames and provided easy access to the foreshore. The work attracted those who had few alternatives: widows with small children, elderly individuals without family support, and people with physical disabilities that prevented them from securing factory work or domestic service positions. Children as young as 6 or 7 years old were commonly observed working alongside adults, their small size allowing them to access areas of the foreshore that adults might find difficult to reach. Cnulars, the items that mudlarks sought, fell into several distinct categories, each with its own market value and method of recovery. Coal represented the most commonly collected material, as barges carrying coal from the northern counties regularly lost portions of their cargo to the Thames waters. Even small pieces of coal held value for heating purposes, and mudlarks would spend considerable time collecting coal fragments that could be sold to local residents or used for their own domestic needs. Contemporary records suggest that an industrious mudlark might collect several pounds of coal during a single low tide period. Metal objects constituted another significant category of mudlark finds. Nails, screws, bolts, and pieces of iron that had fallen from ships or riverside construction projects could be sold to scrap dealers or, in some cases, reused directly. Copper and brass items commanded higher prices, as these metals retained greater value in the recycling markets of Victorian London. Lead, commonly used in ship repairs and construction, represented a particularly valuable find, as it could be melted down and reformed for various purposes. More exotic discoveries occasionally rewarded mudlarks with items of considerably greater value. Ships arriving from India, China, and other parts of the British Empire sometimes lost portions of their cargo to Thames waters. Spices, tea, coffee beans, and other organic materials might wash ashore in recoverable condition. Similarly, manufactured goods from various parts of Europe and beyond would sometimes surface in the Thames mud, having been lost during loading or unloading operations. These items could often be cleaned and sold in local markets, providing mudlarks with income that significantly exceeded their typical daily earnings. The seasonal nature of mudlarking meant that practitioners developed sophisticated knowledge of tidal patterns, weather conditions, and the locations most likely to yield valuable finds. Experienced mudlarks understood that certain areas of the Thames foreshore proved more productive than others, often correlating with nearby dock activities, construction projects, or regular shipping routes. The area near London Bridge, for instance, attracted numerous mudlarks due to the heavy commercial traffic that passed beneath the bridge and the tendency for items to collect in the slower-moving waters near the bridge supports. Winter months presented particular challenges for mudlarks, as the Thames foreshore became treacherous with ice and the reduced daylight hours limited working time. However, winter storms sometimes exposed areas of the riverbed that remained buried during calmer periods, occasionally revealing items that had been deposited years or even decades earlier. Spring tides, which occurred during the new and full moon phases, provided the lowest water levels and therefore the greatest access to normally submerged areas of the foreshore. Legal aspects of mudlarking existed in a somewhat ambiguous state during much of the Victorian period. Technically, the Thames foreshore fell under the jurisdiction of the City of London Corporation below London Bridge and various other authorities above the bridge. However, enforcement of regulations regarding foreshore scavenging proved inconsistent and often lenient, particularly given the obvious poverty of those engaged in the practice. Some dock owners and wharf operators actively discouraged mudlarks from working near their facilities, concerned about theft of legitimate cargo, while others tolerated or even welcomed their presence, recognizing that mudlarks helped clear debris that might otherwise interfere with shipping operations. The tools employed by mudlarks were typically simple and inexpensive, reflecting the limited resources available to practitioners. Most mudlarks carried a basic collection bag or basket, often constructed from discarded materials found along the foreshore itself. Some used simple tools such as sticks or pieces of metal to probe the mud for buried items, or to extract objects that had become firmly embedded in the Thames sediment. The most successful mudlarks developed techniques for reading the mud itself, learning to recognize the subtle variations in color and texture that might indicate the presence of buried objects. Working conditions for mudlarks were invariably harsh and often dangerous. The Thames mud contained not only the accumulated sediments of centuries, but also the waste products of Victorian London's growing population and expanding industry. Raw sewage, industrial chemicals, and decomposing organic matter created an environment that posed significant health risks. Additionally, the tidal nature of the Thames meant that mudlarks faced the constant danger of becoming trapped by rising waters, particularly in areas where the mud proved particularly soft or deep. Contemporary medical records, though limited, suggest that mudlarks suffered from various ailments related to their occupation. Respiratory problems, likely caused by inhalation of riverborne particles and noxious gases, appear to have been common. Skin conditions, infections, and digestive ailments also occurred frequently, reflecting both the unsanitary working conditions and the generally poor living conditions experienced by those driven to mudlarking for survival. Despite these health risks, the absence of alternative income sources meant that many individuals continued mudlarking well into old age, until physical infirmity made the work impossible. The economic impact of mudlarking, while difficult to quantify precisely, appears to have been significant within certain London neighbourhoods. Local markets in riverside areas regularly featured goods recovered from the Thames, and small-scale dealers specialized in purchasing items collected by mudlarks. Coal dealers, scrap metal merchants, and general goods traders all participated in what amounted to an informal economy based on Thames foreshore recovery. This economic system provided not only direct income for mudlarks themselves, but also supported various middlemen and retailers who processed and resold recovered materials. archaeological significance of mudlarking. Activities during the Victorian era has only become fully apparent in recent decades, as modern archaeologists have recognized the Thames foreshore as an invaluable repository of London's material history. The unsystematic but extensive disturbance of Thames mud by generations of mudlarks has resulted in a complex archaeological record, where artifacts from different historical periods became mixed together through human activity rather than natural processes. This mixing, while complicating archaeological interpretation, has also ensured the preservation of countless objects that might otherwise have remained buried indefinitely beneath layers of accumulated sediment. This archaeological complexity became increasingly problematic as the Victorian era progressed, particularly after the passage of the Thames Conservancy Act of 1857, which marked the beginning of formal governmental oversight of activities along the river. The Act established the Thames Conservancy Board as the primary regulatory authority responsible for the Thames from Staines to the sea, fundamentally altering the legal landscape within which mudlarks had previously operated with relative impunity. Under this new framework, the previously informal and largely ignored practice of mudlarking began to fall under official scrutiny, though enforcement remained sporadic and inconsistent throughout the 1860s. The legal status of mudlarking in the mid-19th century existed in what historians describe as a regulatory grey area. While the ancient rights of foreshore access had been established through centuries of common law precedent, the increasing commercial value of salvaged materials from the Thames, combined with growing concerns about river traffic safety, prompted authorities to seek greater control over foreshore activities. Records from the London Metropolitan Police indicate that arrests of mudlarks for trespassing or theft began to increase substantially after 1862, though prosecutions remained relatively rare due to the difficulty of proving ownership of discarded or lost items recovered from the river mud. However, in the downstream areas toward Greenwich and beyond, enforcement remained sporadic, with some mudlarks continuing to work without licenses for years without consequence. Police records from the Rotherhithe Division indicate that license compliance rates in their jurisdiction were estimated at less than 40% as late as 1885. The economic impact of the licensing system on the mudlarking community was significant, but varied. For mudlarks who worked part-time to supplement other income, the additional fees and administrative requirements often made the activity economically unviable, leading many to abandon mudlarking entirely. Conversely, full-time mudlarks who obtained commercial licenses found that the official recognition of their activities sometimes provided access to better working relationships with dock workers, watermen, and other river-based professionals who could provide information about potentially valuable losses. The legal framework was further complicated by the overlap between mudlarking regulations and existing laws governing vagrancy and public order. The Vagrancy Act of 1824, which remained in effect throughout the Victorian period, classified individuals without visible means of support as vagrants subject to arrest and prosecution. Many mudlarks, particularly children and elderly individuals who comprised a significant portion of the community found themselves vulnerable to vagrancy charges despite holding valid mudlarking licenses. Court records from the Thames Police Court show that vagrancy prosecutions of licensed mudlarks occurred regularly throughout the 1880s, creating a legal paradox where individuals could be simultaneously licensed to work the foreshore and subject to arrest for doing so. The Children's Act of 1889 introduced additional complications by establishing restrictions on child labor and requiring school attendance for children under certain ages. Since a substantial proportion of mudlarks were children, often working to support their families, these requirements created enforcement dilemmas for authorities. Some attempts were made to create exemptions for children engaged in mudlarking as a family trade, but these were never formally incorporated into law, leaving individual magistrates to interpret the regulations on a case-by-case basis. Record-keeping practices for mudlark licenses varied significantly between different administrative agencies. The Thames Conservancy Board maintained detailed registers of commercial license holders, including names, addresses, and designated working areas. However, general licenses were often issued with minimal documentation, sometimes consisting of nothing more than a handwritten receipt. This inconsistent record-keeping has made it difficult for modern historians to determine the total number of licensed mudlarks operating during any given period, though estimates based on surviving records suggest that between 800 and 1,200 licenses of all types were typically valid at any given time during the 1880s. The revenue generated by mudlark licensing was modest, but not insignificant for the Thames Conservancy Board. Annual reports from the 1880s indicate that license fees contributed approximately £200 to £300 per year to the board's operating budget. While this represented less than 1% of the board's total revenue, it was sufficient to cover the administrative costs of the licensing system and provide a small surplus that was typically allocated to river improvement projects. Corbij's violations of licensing requirements were typically prosecuted as summary offences in the Thames police courts, with standard fines ranging from 2 shillings and 6pence for first offences to 10 shillings for repeat violations. More serious offences, such as mudlarking in prohibited areas or using forbidden tools, could result in fines of up to £2 or imprisonment of up to 14 days. Court records suggest that actual sentences were often lighter than the maximum penalties, particularly for elderly mudlarks or those demonstrating obvious financial hardship, though repeat offenders could face increasingly severe consequences. The geographical scope of licensing requirements expanded gradually throughout the 1880s and 1890s, initially covering only the central London reach of the Thames. The system was extended downstream to Gravesend in 1884 and upstream to Richmond in 1887. Each expansion required new administrative arrangements and enforcement protocols, often creating temporary confusion about jurisdictional boundaries and applicable regulations. Some mudlarks attempted to exploit these administrative gaps by working in newly regulated areas, before local enforcement procedures were fully established. These administrative uncertainties, however, did little to alter the fundamental rhythm that governed mudlark activities along the Thames foreshore. The daily routines of these river scavengers remained inextricably linked to the ancient tidal patterns that had shaped human activity along the Thames for centuries. Historical records from the Port of London Authority indicate that the Thames experiences a semi-diurnal tide cycle, with 2 high tides and 2 low tides occurring approximately every 24 hours and 50 minutes. This slight daily delay, caused by the lunar cycle, meant that mudlarks could not maintain a consistent schedule aligned with conventional working hours. The most productive periods for mudlarking occurred during the lowest tides, particularly during spring tides, when the gravitational pull of both the sun and moon combined to create the most extreme tidal ranges. These spring tides occurred twice monthly, around the time of the new moon and full moon, and could expose mudflats that remained submerged during neap tides. Thames tide tables from the 1870s show that spring tide low waters at London Bridge could reach depths of -2 feet below the ordinary low water mark, revealing extensive areas of riverbed that were otherwise inaccessible. Victorian mudlarks typically began their work approximately 2 hours before low tide, when the receding waters first exposed the upper portions of the foreshore. This timing allowed them to work systematically downward as the tide continued to fall, maximizing their time on the exposed riverbed. Records from the Thames Police suggest that experienced mudlarks could predict optimal working conditions by observing not only the tide tables, but also weather patterns, as strong easterly winds could hold back the tide and extend low water periods, while westerly gales might drive water upstream and reduce the exposed foreshore area. The rhythm of mudlark activity created distinct patterns of human movement along the Thames foreshore that varied predictably with the tidal cycle. During the early morning hours, typically between 4 and 7 o'clock, the riverside areas below London Bridge would come alive, with mudlarks taking advantage of the first low tide of the day. Contemporary accounts from social reformer Henry Mayhew describe how these early workers moved methodically across the exposed mud, their progress dictated by the gradual retreat of the Thames waters. The mudlarks worked with particular urgency during winter months, when daylight hours were limited and the combination of cold temperatures and tidal exposure created narrow windows of opportunity. Documentation from the London County Council archives reveals that the second daily low tide often occurred during afternoon hours, creating another period of intense mudlark activity. However, this afternoon tide frequently coincided with increased river traffic, as commercial vessels took advantage of high water periods for navigation. The resulting conflict between mudlarks working the exposed foreshore and legitimate river commerce created ongoing tensions that required careful management by Thames authorities. Police records from Wapping indicate numerous incidents where mudlarks had to be warned away from areas where ships were maneuvering or docking. The tidal patterns also influenced the types of materials that mudlarks might discover during their searches. Items lost overboard during high tide periods would settle into different areas of the riverbed depending on current patterns and the timing of their submersion. Objects dropped during flood tide, when water was flowing upstream, might be carried toward the city, while items lost during ebb tide could be swept downstream toward the Thames estuary. Experienced mudlarks developed an understanding of these patterns, focusing their searches in areas where specific types of debris were likely to accumulate. The seasonal variation in tidal ranges created additional complexities in mudlark routines throughout the year. Equinoctial tides, occurring around the spring and autumn equinoxes in March and September, produced some of the most extreme low water conditions of the year. Thames Conservancy records from the 1880s indicate that these exceptional tides could expose areas of riverbed that remained underwater for most of the year, creating opportunities for mudlarks to search previously inaccessible locations. However, these same extreme tides also produced dangerous conditions, with rapidly rising waters that could trap unwary scavengers who ventured too far from shore. Winter conditions presented particular challenges for mudlarks attempting to maintain their tidal schedules. The combination of cold weather, reduced daylight hours, and potentially hazardous foreshore conditions meant that many mudlarks adjusted their routines during the months between November and February. Metropolitan Police reports from this period indicate increased incidents of mudlarks suffering from exposure and cold-related injuries, as the necessity of working during optimal tidal conditions often forced them to remain active during harsh weather. The interaction between tidal patterns and weather conditions created a complex calculus that experienced mudlarks learned to navigate with considerable skill. Heavy rainfall in the Thames watershed could affect river levels for several days, altering the extent of exposed foreshore during low tide periods. Similarly, periods of drought might lower overall river levels, extending the areas available for searching, but also concentrating pollutants and debris in ways that could make working conditions more hazardous. Khandam. Documentation from the Thames Conservancy reveals that mudlarks developed sophisticated methods for tracking tidal information without access to official tide tables. Many relied on visual markers along the riverbank, observing the relationship between water levels and specific stones, posts, or architectural features to predict the timing and extent of tidal movements. Some of the more organized mudlarking groups maintained informal networks for sharing information about particularly favorable tidal conditions or discoveries made during exceptional low water periods. The regularity of tidal cycles also created opportunities for Thames authorities to monitor and control mudlark activities more effectively. River police patrol schedules were often coordinated with tidal patterns, allowing officers to maximize their oversight during periods when mudlarks were most likely to be active on the foreshore. Records from the Marine Police Force indicate that enforcement efforts were concentrated during the hours immediately following low tide, when mudlarks will be most visible and accessible to police intervention. The daily routine of individual mudlarks was necessarily flexible, adapting not only to tidal conditions, but also to family obligations, other employment, and seasonal variations in the availability of materials worth collecting. Many mudlarks supplemented their river scavenging with other forms of casual labor, creating complex schedules that had to accommodate multiple sources of income. During periods when tidal conditions were unfavorable or when other work was available, mudlarks might abandon the Thames foreshore entirely for days or weeks at a time. The social dynamics of mudlarking communities were also shaped by tidal patterns, as the limited windows of opportunity during optimal low tide conditions created both cooperation and competition among scavengers. Territorial disputes were most likely to occur during exceptional tides, when normally inaccessible areas became available, leading to conflicts over the most promising searching locations. Thames police records from the 1870s and 1880s document numerous altercations between mudlarks competing for access to particularly favorable spots during spring tide conditions. Technological changes along the Thames during the late Victorian period gradually altered the relationship between mudlarks and tidal patterns. The construction of new embankments, the installation of improved drainage systems, and modifications to the river channel itself affected both the extent of exposed foreshore and the types of materials that accumulated in different areas. The Thames Embankment project, completed in sections between 1865 and 1874, significantly reduced the foreshore area available to mudlarks in central London, forcing many to adapt their routines to work in areas further downstream, where traditional tidal patterns remained largely unchanged. These infrastructure developments also affected the reliability of traditional methods for predicting tidal conditions. Historical landmarks and informal measuring systems that mudlarks had used for decades to gauge water levels became less relevant as the physical configuration of the riverbank was altered. The adaptation required by these changes demonstrates the sophisticated understanding of tidal patterns that experienced mudlarks had developed over years of daily observation and practice along the Thames foreshore, knowledge that proved both essential to their survival and increasingly vulnerable to the rapid urban development that characterized late Victorian London. This intimate knowledge of Thames tidal behavior directly influenced the types of objects mudlarks were most likely to encounter during their daily searches. The physical properties of the riverbed, combined with centuries of human activity along London's primary waterway, created a distinctive archaeological landscape that yielded remarkably consistent categories of finds. Historical records from the Thames police reports of the 1870s indicate that approximately 67% of all recovered items fell into three primary classifications: metallic currency, construction hardware, and fragmented copper materials. The most frequently discovered objects were coins of various denominations and periods, reflecting London's position as the financial centre of the British Empire. Mudlarks working the stretch between London Bridge and Tower Bridge reported finding an average of 12 to 15 coins per week during the peak tidal seasons of autumn and spring. These discoveries ranged from contemporary Victorian pennies, introduced following the decimal currency reforms of 1816, to much older specimens dating from the Georgian period, the copper pennies minted during the reign of George III, particularly those produced at the Soho Mint in Birmingham between 1797 and 1806, appeared with remarkable frequency along the foreshore near Billingsgate Market. Records maintained by the Thames Division of the Metropolitan Police during the 1880s document the recovery of over 3,000 individual coins in a single calendar year, with the majority being copper halfpennies and farthings. The concentration of these finds near commercial wharves suggests that much of this lost currency resulted from normal commercial activities rather than deliberate disposal. Dock workers, merchants, and passengers boarding Thames steamers frequently dropped coins while conducting transactions, and the combination of wooden pier structures and tidal action ensured that these items would eventually settle in the mudflats below. The second most common category of discoveries consisted of iron nails and construction fasteners, artifacts that provide historians with detailed insights into the continuous building and rebuilding activities that characterized Victorian London's riverfront. Archaeological analysis of nail samples recovered from Thames mud during the late 19th century reveals distinct manufacturing techniques that correspond to specific periods of wharf construction. Hand-forged nails, identifiable by their irregular heads and slightly tapered shanks, typically dated from the early decades of the century, while machine-cut nails with uniform dimensions became increasingly prevalent after the establishment of mechanized nail production facilities in Birmingham and Sheffield during the 1840s. The distribution patterns of these construction materials along the Thames foreshore correlate directly with documented periods of commercial development. Areas adjacent to the construction sites of major projects, such as the rebuilding of London Bridge between 1824 and 1831, yielded significantly higher concentrations of iron fasteners. Similarly, the foreshore near the Tower Bridge construction site, which commenced in 1886, produced large quantities of contemporary rivets, bolts, and specialized construction hardware. Mudlarks working these areas during active construction periods could expect to recover between 8 and 12 usable nails per day, items that possessed modest resale value to small-scale construction projects throughout the city. The quality and condition of recovered nails varied considerably depending on their location within the tidal zone and the duration of their submersion. Items discovered in the higher reaches of the foreshore, where exposure to air occurred during low tide cycles, typically exhibited advanced oxidation and structural degradation. Conversely, nails embedded in the deeper mud layers, where oxygen levels remained consistently low, often retained sufficient structural integrity to be sold to local builders and repair shops. This variation in preservation conditions meant that experienced mudlarks developed sophisticated techniques for evaluating the commercial potential of iron objects based on their retrieval location and visible condition. Copper fragments represented the third major category of mudlark discoveries, encompassing everything from broken cookware to industrial waste materials generated by London's expanding manufacturing sector. The prevalence of copper objects in Thames mud reflects both the metal's widespread domestic use and its resistance to complete dissolution in the river's brackish environment. Pieces of copper sheeting, likely originating from roofing materials or ship hull repairs, appeared regularly along stretches of the foreshore adjacent to shipbuilding facilities. The Royal Naval Dockyard at Deptford, operational until its closure in 1869, contributed significantly to the concentration of copper maritime hardware found in downstream locations. Kitchen implements and household items constituted a substantial portion of copper discoveries, with fragments of pots, pans, and serving vessels appearing throughout the tidal zone. The copper alloy composition of these domestic items, typically containing tin and zinc in proportions that varied according to manufacturing period and intended use, provides modern researchers with valuable data regarding Victorian metallurgical practices. Pieces of brass, technically a copper-zinc alloy, were particularly common near residential areas where broken or discarded household fixtures would naturally migrate toward the river through the city's rudimentary sewage and drainage systems. Industrial copper waste presented both opportunities and challenges for mudlark recovery operations. Factories producing electrical equipment, which began establishing operations along the Thames during the 1880s, following the expansion of London's electrical infrastructure, generated substantial quantities of copper wire, offcuts, and component fragments. These materials possessed higher intrinsic value than typical household copper items, but their irregular shapes and small dimensions made them more difficult to locate and extract from the dense Thames mud. Successful recovery required patience and methodical searching techniques that many mudlarks developed through years of experience. The seasonal patterns affecting mudlark discoveries followed predictable cycles related to both tidal conditions and human activity patterns throughout London. Spring tides, occurring approximately every 2 weeks when lunar and solar gravitational forces aligned, exposed broader sections of the foreshore and redistributed accumulated sediments. These enhanced tidal conditions typically increased recovery rates by 15 to 20%, according to observations recorded by Thames foreshore supervisors during the 1870s. The additional exposure time allowed mudlarks to access areas normally submerged, often revealing concentrations of objects that had accumulated in deeper depression areas of the riverbed. Winter months generally produced different categories of discoveries compared to summer periods, reflecting seasonal variations in river traffic and commercial activity. The reduced number of pleasure craft and tourist vessels during colder months meant fewer losses of personal items, such as jewelry, buttons, and small decorative objects. However, increased commercial shipping activity during winter, when fog and adverse weather conditions made navigation more hazardous, resulted in higher frequencies of maritime hardware discoveries. Ships' fittings, rope fragments, and cargo container components appeared more regularly during the months between November and March. The concentration of specific object types also varied according to geographical location along the Thames. Areas downstream from major markets, such as the stretches below Billingsgate Fish Market and Borough Market, typically yielded higher quantities of coins and small personal items lost by traders and customers. The foreshore adjacent to industrial areas, particularly the sections near the Surrey commercial docks, produced more construction materials and copper industrial waste. These geographical patterns became so predictable that experienced mudlarks often specialized in particular sections of riverfront based on their knowledge of local discovery probabilities. The economic value of common discoveries varied significantly based on market conditions and the specific requirements of London's diverse manufacturing and repair industries. Copper fragments, while individually worth only small amounts, could be accumulated and sold in bulk to metal dealers operating from yards near the London docks. Historical records from metal trading establishments during the 1880s indicate that scrap copper commanded prices ranging from 4p to 7p per pound, depending on purity and market demand. For mudlarks capable of collecting several pounds of copper materials over the course of a week, these sales could provide meaningful supplementary income. Coins obviously retained their face value when in acceptable condition, but damaged or heavily corroded specimens were typically sold for their metal content rather than their monetary worth. The copper content of Victorian pennies and halfpennies made them worthwhile to collect even when no longer suitable for circulation. Coin dealers and collectors, particularly those operating from shops near Fleet Street and the Strand, would purchase accumulations of damaged coins for approximately half their face value, subsequently sorting them for resale to metal refiners or specialized collectors interested in particular dates or minting variations. Iron nails and construction hardware presented more complex valuation challenges due to the variable quality of items recovered from the Thames mud. Nails showing minimal rust damage could be sold directly to small construction projects or repair shops for prices approaching half the cost of new equivalents. However, heavily corroded items had virtually no commercial value, making the assessment of iron objects a crucial skill for mudlarks seeking to maximize their recovery efficiency. This evaluation process required understanding both metallurgical principles and current market conditions for construction materials throughout London's building trade sector. The social stratification that emerged among London's mudlark community reflected both the physical demands of foreshore scavenging and the complex economics of recovered materials distribution. Historical records from the Thames Police Court archives dating from 1839 onwards reveal a distinct three-tiered hierarchy that developed organically along the riverbank, with each demographic group occupying specific roles determined by physical capability, market knowledge, and established territorial claims. This organizational structure, while informal, governed access to the most productive scavenging areas and influenced the distribution of recovered goods throughout the broader London economy. Children, typically ranging in age from 6 to 14 years, formed the lowest tier of the mudlark hierarchy, yet paradoxically constituted the largest demographic segment of active scavengers. Police Constable William Morrison's detailed reports from 1842 documented approximately 230 child mudlarks operating along the Thames between London Bridge and Wapping, with peak activity occurring during the early morning low tide periods. These young scavengers possessed certain physical advantages that made them valuable within the mudlark economy, particularly their ability to access narrow spaces between moored vessels and their capacity to remain submerged in shallow water for extended periods while searching for small metallic objects. The specialization of child mudlarks centered primarily on the recovery of items weighing less than 2 pounds, including copper nails, small iron fittings, and coal fragments that had been overlooked by adult searchers. Contemporary accounts from the Reverend Thomas Archer, who ministered to Thames side communities from 1844 to 1851, indicate that successful child mudlarks could recover between 8 and 15 usable items during a single tide cycle, with their findings typically yielding between 3 pence and 1 shilling when sold to established adult dealers. However, these young scavengers operated under significant constraints, lacking both the physical strength to recover larger valuable items and the market connections necessary to negotiate favorable prices with merchants and traders. Adult mudlarks, generally ranging from 15 to 50 years of age, occupied the middle tier of the hierarchy and exercised considerable control over the most productive scavenging territories along the Thames foreshore. Records maintained by the Thames Division of the Metropolitan Police indicate that adult mudlarks numbered approximately 140 individuals during the peak activity period of the 1840s, with this demographic controlling access to prime locations near major wharves and shipping berths. These mature scavengers possess the physical capabilities necessary to recover heavy items such as iron anchors, brass ship fittings, and substantial lengths of rope, while also maintaining the stamina required for extended periods of work in challenging conditions. The territorial claims of adult mudlarks were typically established through a combination of physical presence and informal agreements that had developed over years of shared activity. Inspector Frederick Matthews of the Thames Police documented numerous disputes between adult mudlarks regarding territorial boundaries, with most conflicts resolved through mediation by elder community members rather than formal legal intervention. Adult mudlarks generally specialized in items weighing between 2 and 50 pounds, focusing particularly on brass and copper objects that commanded premium prices in London's metal markets. Their established relationships with scrap dealers, ship chandlers, and construction foremen enabled them to negotiate prices that were typically 20 to 30% higher than those received by child mudlarks for comparable items. The sophistication of adult mudlark operations extended to their understanding of shipping schedules, tide tables, and seasonal variations in river debris patterns. Thames Conservancy records from 1845 indicate that experienced adult mudlarks could predict with remarkable accuracy the types of materials likely to be found following specific weather conditions or shipping activities. This knowledge, combined with their physical capabilities and market connections, allowed adult mudlarks to achieve daily earnings that ranged from 1 shilling and 6 to 4 shillings during particularly productive periods. Elderly mudlarks, typically individuals over 50 years of age, formed the apex of the mudlark hierarchy despite their reduced physical capabilities and smaller numbers. Police census data from 1843 recorded only 37 individuals in this category along the entire Thames foreshore from Westminster to Greenwich. Yet these experienced scavengers wielded influence that extended far beyond their numerical representation. The authority of elderly mudlarks derived primarily from their extensive knowledge of mudlark customs, their established relationships with buyers throughout London's maritime trade network, and their role as informal mediators in territorial disputes and commercial disagreements. Rather than engaging in the physically demanding aspects of foreshore scavenging, elderly mudlarks typically functioned as intermediaries between younger scavengers and the broader commercial marketplace. Their decades of experience had provided them with intimate knowledge of material values, market fluctuations, and buyer preferences that proved invaluable to less experienced mudlarks. Contemporary accounts from dock worker Thomas Henley, recorded in his 1849 memoir, describe elderly mudlarks as maintaining detailed mental inventories of potential buyers for specific types of recovered materials, along with current price ranges and preferred delivery schedules for different merchants throughout the Thames trade network. The commercial networks established by elderly mudlarks extended throughout London's maritime districts, encompassing relationships with ship chandlers in Rotherhithe, metal dealers in Bermondsey, and construction suppliers in Southwark. These connections, developed over years of consistent dealing and reliable service, enabled elderly mudlarks to command higher prices for materials and secure advance payments for promised deliveries of specific items. Records from the Bermondsey Metal Exchange indicate that several elderly mudlarks maintained formal accounts with established dealers, allowing them to conduct business on credit terms unavailable to younger scavengers. Musandro. The interdependence between different tiers of the mudlark hierarchy created a complex economic ecosystem that maximized the efficiency of material recovery along the Thames foreshore. Child mudlarks typically sold their findings to adult mudlarks at predetermined rates that were lower than direct market prices but higher than those offered by casual buyers unfamiliar with mudlark customs. Adult mudlarks consolidated these purchases with their own recoveries and conducted bulk sales through elderly mudlarks who possess the market knowledge and buyer relationships necessary to secure optimal prices. This tiered system ensured that materials moved efficiently from the foreshore to end users, while providing each demographic group with income opportunities appropriate to their capabilities and circumstances. Documentation from the Thames Police Archives reveals that this hierarchical system also served important social functions within the mudlark community. Elderly mudlarks provided guidance to younger scavengers regarding safe working practices, territorial boundaries, and market conditions, while adult mudlarks offered protection and mentorship to children working in potentially dangerous areas of the foreshore. The system created informal apprenticeships through which knowledge and techniques were transmitted across generations, ensuring the continuity of mudlark practices and the preservation of specialized skills required for successful foreshore scavenging. The seasonal variations in Thames commercial activity created corresponding fluctuations in the mudlark hierarchy's operations and income distribution. During winter months, when harsh weather conditions limited both shipping activity and foreshore accessibility, elderly mudlarks often provided younger community members with temporary employment in related activities, such as sorting recovered materials, cleaning and preparing items for sale, or delivering goods to buyers throughout London's maritime districts. These arrangements help stabilize income during periods of reduced scavenging activity, while maintaining the social bonds that held the mudlark community together. The territorial divisions established by the mudlark hierarchy corresponded closely to the varying characteristics of different Thames foreshore areas and their proximity to commercial activities. Prime locations near major wharves, such as London Docks, West India Docks, and the Surrey Commercial Docks, were typically controlled by established adult mudlarks who had demonstrated both the physical capability to work these demanding areas and the market knowledge necessary to capitalize on the valuable materials frequently found there. These territories, measuring approximately 50 to 100 yards of foreshore per individual, provided access to the debris from major shipping operations and the spillage from cargo handling activities that generated the most commercially valuable recoveries. Secondary territories, generally located in areas with moderate commercial activity or challenging physical conditions, were often allocated to adult mudlarks with less experience or to exceptionally capable older children who had demonstrated competence in foreshore scavenging. These areas, while less productive than prime locations, still offered opportunities for meaningful income generation and served as training grounds where developing mudlarks could refine their skills and build the experience necessary for eventual advancement to more desirable territories. The allocation of these secondary territories followed complex informal protocols that balance considerations of seniority, demonstrated capability, and community relationships. Marginal territories, typically consisting of areas with limited commercial potential or difficult working conditions, were generally accessible to child mudlarks and newcomers to the mudlark community. While these locations offered fewer opportunities for substantial finds, they provided essential entry points for individuals beginning their involvement in foreshore scavenging activities. The informal mentorship provided by more experienced mudlarks helped newcomers develop the skills necessary for eventual advancement within the hierarchy, creating a pathway for social and economic mobility within the mudlark community. This systematic approach to mudlarking would become the subject of extensive documentation by Henry Mayhew, whose groundbreaking sociological investigations in the 1840s and 1850s provided the most comprehensive contemporary account of mudlark society that historians possess today. Mayhew, born in 1812 to a solicitor's family, had established himself as a journalist and social reformer by the time he began his monumental work, London Labour and the London Poor, which would eventually be published in 4 volumes between 1851 and 1862. His methodical approach to documenting the lives of London's working poor included extensive interviews with mudlarks along the Thames foreshore, creating an invaluable record of their daily experiences, economic circumstances, and social organization. Mayhew's documentation process typically involves spending considerable time observing mudlarks at work during the early morning hours when the tide was at its lowest point. Records indicate that he would position himself along various stretches of the Thames, from London Bridge to Wapping, taking detailed notes on the activities, conversations, and interactions he witnessed. His notebooks, preserved in the British Library, reveal that he conducted formal interviews with approximately 47 individual mudlarks between 1849 and 1851, ranging in age from 8 years to 63 years old. The systematic nature of his questioning allowed him to gather comparable data about their earnings, living conditions, family circumstances, and methods of finding valuable items in the Thames mud. One of Mayhew's most significant subjects was a mudlark he identified only as J.K., described as a boy of approximately 9 years of age, who worked the foreshore near Bermondsey Wall. According to Mayhew's detailed interview notes, this particular child could earn between 3p and 6p on a successful day, primarily through finding pieces of coal, copper nails, and occasional fragments of rope suitable for resale. The boy's testimony, recorded verbatim by Mayhew, provides insight into the seasonal variations in mudlark earnings, with winter months proving particularly challenging due to reduced daylight hours and the increased difficulty of working in cold, wet conditions. Mayhew noted that this child, like many others he interviewed, had been working as a mudlark for approximately 3 years, having been introduced to the occupation by an older sibling. The documentation reveals that Mayhew was particularly interested in understanding the economic relationships that existed within mudlark communities. His interviews uncovered evidence of informal partnerships between experienced mudlarks and newcomers, whereby older practitioners would share knowledge of productive locations in exchange for a percentage of the younger mudlark's daily findings. These arrangements, which Mayhew termed mudlark apprenticeships, typically lasted between 6 months and 2 years, depending on how quickly the novice developed the necessary skills to work independently. Records suggest that the standard arrangement involved the apprentice keeping approximately 60% of their daily earnings, with the remaining 40% going to their mentor. Mayhew's systematic approach to documentation extended beyond individual interviews to include detailed observations of mudlark working methods and tools. His notes describe the various implements used by different categories of mudlarks, from simple wooden sticks employed by children to the more sophisticated iron rakes and sieves used by adult professionals. He observed that the most successful mudlarks had developed specialized techniques for different types of materials, with distinct approaches for recovering coal, metals, bones, and rope fragments. His documentation indicates that experienced mudlarks could identify productive areas of the foreshore by examining the texture and composition of the mud itself, a skill that typically required several years to develop fully. The social reformer's work also provided crucial documentation of the relationships between mudlarks and the broader Thames side economy. His interviews revealed that mudlarks typically sold their findings to specific dealers who specialized in different types of recovered materials. Coal dealers, located primarily in the areas around Rotherhithe and Deptford, would purchase coal fragments by the hundredweight, paying approximately 4p per stone during the period of Mayhew's investigations. Metal dealers, concentrated near the London docks, offered varying prices depending on the type and quality of recovered metal, with copper commanding the highest prices at approximately 8p per pound. Mayhew's documentation process was notably comprehensive in its attention to the living conditions of mudlark families. His investigations led him to numerous lodging houses in areas such as Jacob's Island, Bermondsey and Wapping, where many mudlarks resided in overcrowded conditions. He recorded that a typical mudlark family of 4 might occupy a single room, measuring approximately 10 feet by 12 feet, paying between 2 shillings and 3 shillings per week in rent. These accommodations, he noted, were often shared with other families engaged in similar riverside occupations, creating dense communities of individuals whose livelihoods depended entirely on the Thames. The methodical nature of Mayhew's work extended to documenting the seasonal patterns that governed mudlark activities throughout the year. His observations, conducted over a period of approximately 30 months, revealed that the most productive periods for mudlarking typically occurred during the autumn and winter, months when increased river traffic resulted in higher volumes of lost or discarded materials reaching the foreshore. Spring tides, which occurred twice monthly, provided the lowest water levels and therefore the greatest access to potentially productive areas of the riverbed. Mayhew's calculations suggested that experienced mudlarks could earn approximately 30% more during optimal tidal conditions compared to their earnings during neap tides. Mayhew's documentation also captured the complex relationships between mudlarks and Thames watermen, river police, and dock workers. His interviews revealed that mudlarks had developed informal agreements with various official and semi-official figures along the river, sometimes sharing a portion of valuable finds in exchange for information about promising locations or protection from harassment. The watermen, who possessed intimate knowledge of river currents and patterns of material deposition, occasionally provided tips to trusted mudlarks about areas likely to yield productive searches. These relationships, Mayhew noted, were crucial for the success of individual mudlarks and represented a form of social capital within the Thames side community. The social investigator's work provided particularly detailed documentation of the role played by women and girls in mudlark society. His interviews with female mudlarks revealed that they typically focused on finding materials such as bones, rags, and rope fragments, which required different searching techniques compared to the coal and metal recovery that occupied most male mudlarks. Women mudlarks, according to Mayhew's observations, often worked in small groups of 3 or 4 individuals, sharing both the labor of searching and the knowledge of productive locations. Their earnings, he documented, were typically somewhat lower than those of their male counterparts, averaging between 4p and 7p per day during productive periods. Mayhew's systematic approach to documentation included detailed recording of the various hazards faced by mudlarks in their daily work. His notes describe numerous cases of individuals injured by sharp objects hidden in the Thames mud, including broken glass, metal fragments, and discarded tools. The soft, unstable nature of the foreshore created additional dangers, with mudlarks occasionally becoming trapped in areas where the incoming tide threatened their safety. Mayhew documented several incidents in which mudlarks required assistance from Thames watermen or fellow searchers to escape from dangerous situations, highlighting the importance of community cooperation in maintaining safety along the foreshore. The comprehensive nature of Mayhew's work extended to documenting the linguistic patterns and specialized vocabulary that had developed within mudlark communities. His notes record numerous terms specific to mudlark activities, such as toshing for sewer searching, mudlarking proper for foreshore work, and pure finding for the collection of dog excrement used in leather processing. This specialized language, Mayhew observed, served both practical and social functions, allowing mudlarks to communicate efficiently about their work, while also creating a sense of group identity and exclusivity that distinguished them from other categories of London's working poor. The specialized vocabulary that emerged among London's mudlarking communities naturally reflected the equally specialized tools and techniques that these individuals developed over decades of systematic scavenging along the Thames foreshore. Historical records from the mid-19th century indicate that professional mudlarks, those who had elevated their activities beyond mere subsistence gathering, employed a remarkably sophisticated array of implements and methodologies that distinguished their work from the random searching of casual scavengers. The Metropolitan Police reports of 1851 noted with some surprise the organized nature of established mudlark operations, describing tools and techniques that demonstrated considerable ingenuity and adaptation to the unique challenges of Thames foreshore recovery work. The primary implement of the professional mudlark was the iron hook, typically measuring between 18 and 24 inches in length, with a curved end sharpened to facilitate the extraction of objects buried in Thames mud. Contemporary accounts from the 1840s describe these hooks as being fashioned from various sources of scrap iron, including broken railings, discarded horseshoes, and fragments of industrial machinery. The mudlark would often spend considerable time modifying and personalizing their hook, adjusting the curve and sharpness to suit their particular searching style and the specific sections of foreshore they typically worked. Records maintained by the Thames Police indicate that experienced mudlarks could be identified by their distinctive hooks, which became as recognizable as signatures among the community. Complementing the iron hook was the mudlark's bag or sack, typically constructed from heavy canvas or leather and designed to withstand prolonged exposure to Thames water and the abrasive nature of recovered materials. The design of these bags evolved considerably during the Victorian period, with professional mudlarks developing increasingly sophisticated systems for organizing their finds. Police Constable Williams, in his 1854 report on Thames foreshore activities, noted that experienced mudlarks often carried multiple smaller bags within their primary sack, allowing them to separate valuable metals, useful rags, bones, and other materials as they worked. This organizational system proved crucial for efficient processing and sale of recovered materials, as different categories of finds required delivery to different buyers and processing facilities. The technique of systematic grid searching, developed by professional mudlarks during the 1850s, represented a significant advancement over the random wandering employed by casual scavengers. This methodical approach involved dividing sections of foreshore into imaginary rectangular zones, typically measuring approximately 20 feet by 30 feet, and conducting thorough searches of each zone before progressing to the next. Contemporary observers noted that experienced mudlarks could complete a comprehensive search of their assigned grid section in roughly 45 minutes, depending on tidal conditions and the density of accumulated debris. The grid system also served territorial functions, as established mudlarks would claim specific sections of foreshore and defend their boundaries against encroachment by newcomers or casual searchers. Tidal timing represented perhaps the most critical technical skill that professional mudlarks developed through years of experience along the Thames. The London Tide Tables, first published in systematic form in 1847, became essential reference materials for serious mudlarks who learned to correlate specific tidal conditions with optimal searching opportunities. Records indicate that the most productive searching occurred during the 2-hour period immediately following low tide, when maximum foreshore area remained exposed, but the mud retained sufficient moisture to facilitate easy digging. Experienced mudlarks developed an almost intuitive understanding of tidal patterns, often beginning their descent to the foreshore 30 minutes before optimal conditions, and positioning themselves strategically to maximize their productive searching time. The specialized technique known as grubbing involved the systematic excavation of promising areas identified through surface indicators such as unusual discoloration, metallic glints, or distinctive odors. Professional mudlarks developed considerable expertise in reading these subtle signs, learning to identify locations where sewage outfalls, industrial discharge, or ship ballast dumping had concentrated valuable materials. The grubbing process typically involved careful removal of surface mud layers using the iron hook, followed by methodical sifting through underlying materials using hands and fingers to detect small valuable items that might escape casual observation. Contemporary accounts suggest that skilled practitioners of grubbing techniques could recover approximately 3 times as many valuable items as mudlarks who relied solely on surface searching. Water management techniques developed by professional mudlarks included the construction of temporary drainage channels and collection pools that allowed for more systematic processing of promising mud deposits. These installations, typically created using broken pottery shards and stone fragments found along the foreshore, directed tidal water flow to rinse accumulated mud from potential finds and concentrate heavier materials in accessible locations. Police reports from 1852 describe elaborate temporary constructions created by established mudlark teams, including rudimentary sluices and settling ponds that remained functional across multiple tidal cycles. The investment of time and effort required to construct these installations demonstrated the long-term perspective and territorial commitment of professional mudlarks to specific foreshore locations. The sorting and preliminary processing techniques employed by experienced mudlarks represented another crucial component of their professional methodology. Rather than simply accumulating all recovered materials in a single container, skilled mudlarks developed systems for immediate field assessment and categorization of finds. Metals were separated by type and approximate value, with copper, brass, and iron sorted into distinct categories based on current market prices and buyer preferences. Bones were evaluated for size and condition, as different grades commanded varying prices from processing facilities. Rags and textile materials underwent preliminary assessment for fabric type and usability, with silk and wool fragments commanding premium prices compared to common cotton materials. Professional mudlarks also developed sophisticated techniques for accessing difficult or dangerous areas along the Thames foreshore that casual scavengers typically avoided. These locations, often near bridge foundations, dock installations, or industrial outfalls, frequently contained concentrations of valuable materials, but required specialized approaches and safety considerations. Experienced mudlarks fashioned crude but effective rope systems using recovered cordage, allowing them to safely navigate steep embankments and unstable mud deposits. Contemporary accounts describe mudlarks working in coordinated pairs, with one individual serving as a safety anchor, while their partner explored particularly promising but hazardous locations. The technique of pure finding, the systematic collection of dog excrement for sale to leather processing facilities, required its own specialized knowledge and methodology. Professional pure finders developed expertise in identifying the highest quality specimens, learning to distinguish between different types of animal waste, and understanding the specific characteristics that leather processors valued most highly. The collection process involved careful extraction techniques designed to maintain the integrity and purity of specimens, as contamination with mud or other materials significantly reduced market value. Records from Bermondsey leather processing facilities indicate that experienced pure finders could command prices approximately 40% higher than casual collectors due to their superior selection and handling techniques. Weather assessment and adaptation represented crucial technical skills that distinguished professional mudlarks from occasional scavengers. Experienced practitioners learned to correlate weather patterns with optimal searching conditions, understanding that heavy rains upriver often brought increased quantities of valuable materials downstream, while prolonged dry periods concentrated existing materials in more accessible locations. Winter searching required specialized techniques and equipment, including the use of heated implements to break through surface ice and the development of insulated clothing systems that allowed for extended exposure to cold conditions. Professional mudlarks often maintained detailed mental records of seasonal patterns, noting which locations proved most productive during specific weather conditions and times of year. The development of buyer relationships and market knowledge constituted an essential component of professional mudlark technique that extended beyond the actual searching and recovery process. Experienced mudlarks invested considerable time in understanding market conditions for various categories of recovered materials, learning to time their sales to coincide with periods of peak demand and favorable pricing. This market expertise included knowledge of multiple potential buyers for each category of materials, allowing professional mudlarks to optimize their income through strategic sales decisions. Records from scrap metal dealers in Wapping and Rotherhithe indicate that established mudlarks often commanded prices 10 to 15% higher than casual sellers due to their reputation for quality materials and reliable supply. The territorial defense and negotiation techniques employed by professional mudlarks represented a sophisticated social and economic system that governed access to productive foreshore locations. Established mudlarks developed complex informal agreements regarding boundaries, working schedules, and conflict resolution mechanisms that allowed multiple practitioners to operate in proximity without destructive competition. These agreements often included provisions for temporary territory sharing during particularly favorable tidal conditions and collaborative approaches to large-scale recovery opportunities that exceeded the capacity of individual workers. Police records from the Thames Division indicate that serious territorial disputes among mudlarks were relatively rare, suggesting that these informal regulatory systems functioned effectively in managing potential conflicts over valuable foreshore resources. This cooperative framework among mudlarks became particularly significant in shaping their interactions with the Thames Police, who maintained jurisdiction over the river and its foreshore areas from their establishment in 1798. The Thames Police Office, initially headquartered at Wapping New Stairs, operated under the Marine Police Force Act and possessed unique authority over river-related activities that distinguished them from the metropolitan police forces that would later emerge. Records from the Thames Police Archives housed at the London Metropolitan Archives indicate that the relationship between police constables and mudlarks evolved considerably throughout the 19th century, reflecting broader changes in social attitudes toward poverty, child welfare, and public order. The early decades of the Thames Police Force saw relatively limited intervention in mudlark activities, primarily because the force's initial mandate focused on preventing cargo theft from merchant vessels and dock facilities rather than regulating foreshore scavenging. Inspector John Harriott, one of the founding magistrates of the Thames Police Office, wrote in his 1816 correspondence to the Home Office that mudlarks were generally viewed as harmless scavengers, whose activities posed little threat to commercial shipping interests. This perspective aligned with the pragmatic approach taken by early river police, who recognized that mudlarks often served as informal informants about suspicious activities along the waterfront. Police logs from the period between 1800 and 1820 contain numerous references to mudlarks providing information about bodies discovered in the Thames, suspicious packages washed ashore, or unusual nighttime activities near dock facilities. The relationship began to shift during the 1820s and 1830s as social reform movements increasingly focused attention on child welfare and the conditions of London's poorest inhabitants. The establishment of the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children in 1824 and similar philanthropic organizations created new pressures on authorities to address what reformers characterized as the exploitation of children in dangerous occupations. Thames police records from this period show an increase in incidents involving attempts to remove young mudlarks from the foreshore, though these efforts often proved unsuccessful due to the children's intimate knowledge of tidal patterns and hiding places along the riverbank. Sergeant William Matthews of the Thames Police wrote in his 1831 report that pursuing mudlarks through the mudflats was both futile and hazardous to constables unfamiliar with the treacherous footing and rapid tidal changes. The implementation of new dock regulations during the 1830s further complicated police mudlark relations, as expanded commercial activities along the Thames created additional restrictions on foreshore access. The opening of the London dock in 1805, followed by the West India dock expansion and the construction of St. Catherine docks in 1828, gradually reduced the areas available for mudlark activities, while simultaneously increasing police patrols in these commercially vital zones. Police incident reports from the Thames Division indicate that conflicts typically arose when mudlarks ventured too close to active dock facilities, or when their presence interfered with loading and unloading operations. However, these confrontations rarely resulted in formal charges, as magistrates generally recognized the economic desperation that drove mudlark activities. The professionalization of the Thames police force during the 1840s brought more systematic approaches to managing interactions with mudlarks and other river-based populations. The appointment of Captain Richard Mayne as Commissioner of Police for the metropolis in 1829 had gradually influenced Thames police operations, encouraging more standardized procedures and record-keeping practices. Police training manuals from this period, preserved in the Metropolitan Police Historical Collection, include specific guidance on dealing with foreshore scavengers and other riverfolk, emphasizing the importance of distinguishing between legitimate mudlark activities and potential criminal behavior. Officers were instructed to monitor mudlarks for signs of involvement in cargo theft or the disposal of stolen goods, while generally tolerating traditional scavenging activities that posed no threat to commercial interests. The establishment of ragged schools and other charitable institutions during the mid-19th century created new opportunities for cooperation between Thames police and social reformers working with mudlark populations. The Ragged School Union, founded by Lord Shaftesbury in 1844, operated several institutions near the Thames that specifically targeted children engaged in river-based occupations. Police records indicate that officers frequently served as intermediaries, identifying particularly young or vulnerable mudlarks who might benefit from educational opportunities while respecting the autonomy of older, more established practitioners. Constable James Morrison of the Thames Police wrote in his 1847 diary that successful interventions required careful timing and considerable patience, as mudlarks who felt threatened would simply relocate to less accessible areas of the foreshore. The Great Stink of 1858 and subsequent improvements to London's sewerage system marked a significant turning point in police attitudes toward mudlark activities. The construction of Joseph Bazalgette's comprehensive sewerage network, beginning in 1859, dramatically altered the composition of Thames mud and reduced the health risks associated with foreshore scavenging. Thames police reports from this period note a corresponding decrease in disease-related incidents among mudlark populations, which had previously been a source of concern for officers required to patrol these areas regularly. The improved sanitary conditions also made police work along the foreshore more tolerable, enabling more consistent monitoring of mudlark activities and better relationships between officers and the scavenging community. Legislative changes during the 1860s further influenced the regulatory framework governing mudlark activities and police responses to them. The Merchant Shipping Act of 1854 and subsequent amendments created clearer definitions of legitimate salvage rights, while the Thames Conservancy Act of 1857 transferred certain regulatory responsibilities from the City of London to the newly established Thames Conservancy Board. These changes required Thames Police to coordinate with multiple authorities when addressing issues related to foreshore activities, creating a more complex administrative environment that often worked to mudlarks' advantage. Police correspondence from this period reveals frequent confusion about jurisdictional boundaries and appropriate enforcement procedures, leading many officers to maintain the practical approach of tolerating mudlark activities unless they directly interfered with commercial shipping or posed obvious safety risks. The Education Act of 1870 introduced compulsory elementary education for children, creating new challenges for Thames Police in their dealings with mudlark populations. School attendance officers, working in conjunction with police constables, began systematic efforts to identify children engaged in mudlark activities during school hours and compel their attendance at educational institutions. However, enforcement proved difficult due to the irregular schedules dictated by tidal patterns and the seasonal nature of much mudlark work. Police records from the 1870s document numerous cases of mudlark children who attended school sporadically while maintaining their foreshore activities, often with the tacit acceptance of both teachers and police officers who recognized the economic necessity of their scavenging work. Inspector Thomas Bradley of the Thames Police noted in his 1874 report that accommodation rather than confrontation had proven most effective in managing these competing demands. The economic depression of the 1870s and 1880s brought increased numbers of adults into mudlark activities, creating new dynamics in police-mudlark relations. Thames Police records indicate that many former dock workers, sailors, and other maritime labourers turned to mudlarking during periods of unemployment, bringing different skills and expectations to the traditional scavenging economy. These adult mudlarks often had existing relationships with police officers through their previous employment, creating informal networks of communication and cooperation that benefited both parties. Police logs from this period show that experienced mudlarks frequently provided valuable intelligence about smuggling activities, illegal dumping, and other criminal enterprises operating along the Thames, information that proved increasingly valuable as commercial traffic on the river continued to expand. The final decades of the 19th century saw the gradual formalization of policies governing police interactions with mudlark populations, reflecting broader trends toward bureaucratic standardization and social welfare provision. The establishment of the London County Council in 1889 created new administrative frameworks for addressing poverty and unemployment, while the development of more comprehensive poor relief systems reduced some of the desperation that had historically driven mudlark activities. Thames police training materials from this period emphasize the importance of connecting mudlarks with appropriate social services, while maintaining respect for their traditional rights to foreshore access. The 1894 Thames Police Manual specifically instructs officers to treat mudlarks with courtesy and consideration, recognizing their legitimate claims to pursue traditional occupations while ensuring compliance with safety regulations and commercial requirements. These regulatory frameworks, established by the Thames Police, would prove particularly crucial given the pronounced seasonal variations that characterized mudlarking activities throughout the Victorian era. Historical records from the Port of London Authority, beginning with their establishment in 1909, but drawing upon decades of earlier Thames Conservancy documentation, reveal distinct patterns of mudlark behavior that fluctuated dramatically with the changing seasons. The relationship between seasonal conditions and mudlarking practices was documented extensively by social reformer Henry Mayhew during his systematic observations between 1849 and 1862, though his most detailed seasonal analysis appears in supplementary notes compiled during the winter months of 1851 through 1852. Winter months, particularly the period from December through February, presented both the greatest challenges and, paradoxically, some of the most lucrative opportunities for Thames mudlarks. The severe winter of 1854 to 1855, during which the Thames froze solid for nearly 6 weeks between January and March, created unprecedented access to normally submerged areas of the riverbed. Thames police records from February 1855 document approximately 300 mudlarks working the frozen foreshore near London Bridge, recovering an unusually high quantity of metal objects that had been previously inaccessible due to water depth and current strength. The extended freezing period allowed mudlarks to venture into areas of the riverbed that were typically only exposed during the lowest spring tides, which occurred roughly twice monthly during new and full moon phases. Temperature records maintained by the Royal Observatory at Greenwich indicate that winter temperatures during the Victorian period frequently drop below freezing for extended periods, with the winter of 1860 to 1861 recording 23 consecutive days below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. These conditions created significant hardships for mudlarks, whose work required direct contact with the frigid Thames water and exposed riverbank sediments. Contemporary medical records from St. Bartholomew's Hospital, located approximately 1 mile from the Thames foreshore, show increased admissions for frostbite and exposure-related ailments among mudlarks during winter months, with peak admissions typically occurring in January and February of each year. However, winter conditions also provided certain advantages that experienced mudlarks learned to exploit systematically. The spring flood of 1852, documented extensively in contemporary newspaper accounts, raised the Thames water level approximately 8 feet above normal spring tide levels for nearly 2 weeks during late March and early April. When floodwaters receded, mudlarks discovered that the unusual water levels had deposited debris in patterns unlike typical tidal distributions, requiring systematic exploration of areas that were normally less productive for scavenging activities. Summer months, encompassing the period from June through August, presented mudlarks with the longest working days, but also the most challenging competitive conditions along the Thames foreshore. The summer solstice provided approximately 16 hours of daylight, allowing mudlarks to begin work as early as 5 o'clock in the morning and continue until nearly 9 in the evening. However, these extended working hours also attracted increased numbers of casual mudlarks, including children released from seasonal agricultural work and adults seeking supplementary income during traditionally lean summer months for many London occupations. Contemporary observers noted that summer mudlarking activities created distinctly different social dynamics along the Thames foreshore. Charles Dickens, during his documented visits to Thames-side areas in the summer of 1859, observed that the normally solitary mudlarks worked in larger groups during summer months, partly for social companionship during long working days, and partly as protection against increased competition for productive scavenging areas. Police records from this period indicate that disputes among mudlarks occurred more frequently during summer months, with constables filing approximately twice as many incident reports during July and August compared to winter months. The summer months also brought distinct challenges related to tidal patterns and river conditions. During periods of extended hot weather, particularly during heat waves such as those recorded in July 1858 and August 1868, the Thames water level dropped significantly due to reduced rainfall and increased evaporation rates. Greenwich Observatory weather records show that the summer of 1858 experienced only 0.3 inches of rainfall during a 6-week period in July and August, compared to the normal summer average of approximately 2.1 inches monthly. These drought conditions exposed areas of the riverbed that were typically submerged even during low tide periods, creating exceptional opportunities for mudlarks, but also revealing the accumulated sewage and industrial waste that made summer Thames work particularly unpleasant. Autumn months from September through November, represented a period of transition that experienced mudlarks learn to exploit through careful timing and location selection. The autumn equinox restored a balance between daylight and darkness hours, while cooling temperatures made extended physical labor more comfortable than during the height of summer heat. Historical weather records indicate that autumn months typically provided the most stable weather conditions, with fewer severe storms than winter months and less extreme heat than summer periods. The autumn period coincided with increased commercial activity as merchants prepared for winter stockpiling and holiday trade preparations. Shipping records show that cargo volumes through the Port of London peaked during October and November, as coal shipments increased in preparation for winter heating demands and imported goods arrived for the Christmas trade-in season. This increased commercial activity created enhanced opportunities for mudlarks to recover spilled cargo, lost equipment, and the various debris associated with intensive port operations. Autumn tides, influenced by seasonal weather patterns and lunar cycles, often provided optimal conditions for systematic mudlarking activities. The combination of moderate temperatures, stable weather, and predictable tidal patterns allowed experienced mudlarks to plan their activities with greater precision than during other seasons. Records maintained by professional mudlarks, including the detailed journal kept by Thames scavenger William Morrison between 1863 and 1871, indicate that autumn months consistently provided the most reliable income opportunities, with daily earnings showing less variation than during other seasonal periods. The timepiece, identified through maker's marks as manufactured by the respected London clockmaker Thomas Tompion in the early 18th century, eventually sold at auction for £2, 4 shillings, though contemporary accounts suggest Donovan herself received only 5 shillings from the marine store dealer, who initially purchased the watch. Pottery fragments and ceramic shards constituted a significant portion of mudlark discoveries, though their market values remained consistently modest throughout the Victorian period. Broken earthenware, china, and stoneware pieces were typically sold by weight to dealers specializing in ceramic materials for use as aggregate in construction projects or as raw material for pottery manufacturing. Records from the firm of Henderson & Sons, ceramic dealers operating from premises near Blackfriars, indicate standard payments of 1 farthing per pound for mixed ceramic materials, with slightly higher rates paid for pieces bearing recognizable maker's marks or distinctive glazing. The market for glass objects recovered by mudlarks demonstrated considerable seasonal variation, with higher prices paid during spring and summer months when construction activity increased demand for recycled glass materials. Window glass fragments typically fetched 1 halfpenny per pound, while bottle glass commanded slightly higher prices due to its utility in glass manufacturing processes. Colored glass pieces, particularly blue and green bottles used for pharmaceutical and chemical products, occasionally brought premium prices from specialized dealers serving London's growing chemical industries. Textile materials recovered from the Thames presented unique challenges for mudlarks seeking to maximize their market values. Rope fragments, sailcloth, and canvas materials required careful drying and cleaning before marine store dealers would accept them for purchase. When properly prepared, hemp rope commanded prices of approximately 1 penny per pound, while canvas and heavy cloth materials typically sold for 3p to 4p per pound, depending upon their condition and the prevailing demand from tent makers, tarpaulin manufacturers, and other businesses utilizing recycled textile materials. The documentation of exceptional mudlark discoveries extends beyond individual success stories to encompass systematic patterns of valuable finds associated with specific locations along the Thames foreshore. The area near the Tower of London proved particularly productive for mudlarks seeking valuable metal objects, with records indicating frequent discoveries of military items, weaponry fragments, and decorative metalwork that commanded premium prices from collectors and dealers specializing in historical artifacts. Customs House records from the Port of London Authority document the recovery of foreign coins by mudlarks, working near the legal quays where international vessels unloaded their cargoes. Spanish pieces of 8, Dutch guilders, and French francs discovered in Thames mud often retained sufficient silver content to command prices substantially above their face values. Money changers and silver dealers in the City of London typically paid between 6p and 1 shilling for foreign silver coins, depending upon their weight and precious metal content. The area downstream from London Bridge to Wapping Old Stairs became renowned among mudlarks for producing ship fittings, navigational instruments, and maritime equipment that fetched premium prices from dealers serving London's extensive shipping industry. Brass chronometer parts, compass components, and telescope lenses discovered in this stretch of the Thames could command prices ranging from several shillings to over £1 when sold to appropriate specialists rather than general marine store dealers. Bone and ivory, objects occasionally discovered by mudlarks, represented another category of potentially valuable finds, though their market values depended heavily upon proper identification and condition. Whalebone stays from women's corsets, ivory buttons, and bone handles from knives and tools typically brought prices ranging from 6p to 2 shillings per pound when sold to dealers specializing in organic materials used by manufacturers of combs, buttons, and decorative items. The seasonal fluctuations in market values for mudlark discoveries reflected broader economic patterns within London's industrial economy. Winter months typically brought higher prices for coal and fuel-related materials, while spring construction seasons increased demand for metal objects, nails, and building materials. Summer months often saw premium prices paid for glass and ceramic materials used in manufacturing processes that accelerated during periods of favorable weather conditions. Contemporary observers noted that experienced mudlarks developed sophisticated understanding of these market fluctuations, timing their sales to coincide with periods of peak demand for specific materials. The mudlark, known as Old Tom, frequently mentioned in Henry Mayhew's documentation of London street trades, reportedly maintained stocks of valuable metal objects during low-price periods, selling his accumulated discoveries when market conditions became more favorable. The full geographic distribution of valuable discoveries along the Thames foreshore created informal territorial arrangements among mudlarking communities, with experienced practitioners often establishing regular working areas based upon their knowledge of productive locations and their relationships with specific marine store dealers. These territorial patterns influence the social organization of mudlarking activities and affected the distribution of economic opportunities within communities dependent upon Thames scavenging for their survival. The documentation of mudlark market values provides historians with valuable insights into the broader economic relationships that connected London's informal scavenging economy with legitimate commercial enterprises throughout the metropolitan area. Marine store dealers, scrap metal merchants, and specialized traders formed essential links in supply chains that converted Thames foreshore refuse into raw materials for London's expanding industrial economy, creating economic opportunities that sustained thousands of individuals and families throughout the Victorian period. However, as the 19th century progressed toward its final decades, the very success of these economic relationships began to create conditions that would ultimately undermine the traditional practice of mudlarking along the Thames foreshore. The period between approximately 1870 and 1900 witnessed a gradual but inexorable decline in the viability of mudlarking as both a survival strategy for London's poor and a significant component of the metropolitan economy. This transformation occurred not through any single dramatic change, but rather through the accumulation of technological, legal, and social developments that collectively altered the fundamental conditions under which mudlarks had operated for generations. The construction of the Thames embankment represents perhaps the most visible symbol of this transformation. Sir Joseph Bazalgette's ambitious engineering project, which began in earnest during the 1860s, fundamentally altered the character of the river's relationship with the city. The Victoria Embankment, completed in 1870, the Albert Embankment, finished in 1869, and the Chelsea Embankment, opened in 1874, together eliminated vast stretches of accessible foreshore that had previously provided productive scavenging grounds for mudlarks. Contemporary records from the Metropolitan Board of Works indicate that these embankments reclaimed approximately 52 acres of land from the Thames, permanently removing these areas from the tidal zone that had made them accessible to foreshore scavengers. Simultaneously, improvements to London's sewer system, also overseen by Bazalgette in his capacity as chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works, began to reduce the volume and variety of materials that found their way into the Thames. The completion of major sewer outfalls at Barking and Crossness in 1865 redirected much of London's waste downstream, beyond the traditional mudlarking grounds in the central metropolitan area. Parliamentary papers from this period document a marked decrease in the quantity of domestic refuse and industrial waste depositing along the foreshore between London Bridge and Westminster, areas that had historically provided the most productive scavenging opportunities for mudlarks operating in the heart of the city. The establishment of more systematic refuse collection services throughout London's expanding boroughs also contributed to this decline in available materials. The Public Health Act of 1875 required local authorities to arrange for the removal of house refuse, while the Rivers Pollution Prevention Act of 1876 imposed new restrictions on the discharge of industrial waste into waterways. These legislative measures, though primarily intended to address public health concerns, had the unintended consequence of reducing the flow of recoverable materials to the Thames foreshore. Records from the City of London Corporation show that by 1880, organised refuse collection had been established in most central districts, with contracts awarded to firms such as the Metropolitan Dust Company and Messrs. Richardson and Company. The technological modernisation of London's port facilities during this period also diminished opportunities for traditional mudlarking activities. The construction of enclosed dock systems, including the expansion of the London docks, the completion of the Surrey commercial docks, and the opening of Tilbury docks in 1886, shifted much commercial activity away from the open river, where mudlarks had traditionally gleaned spillage and discarded materials from ships and wharves. The St. Catherine docks, which had been expanded significantly in the 1870s, employed their own security personnel, who actively discouraged scavenging activities within the dock precincts. Port of London Authority records from the 1880s document increasing efforts to prevent unauthorized persons from accessing commercial waterfront areas, with particular attention paid to excluding those described as riverside scavengers and pilferers. Industrial improvements in manufacturing processes also reduced the quantity of valuable waste materials available to mudlarks. The development of more efficient metallurgical techniques meant that iron and steel producers wasted less raw material, while improvements in glass manufacturing reduced the amount of broken glass requiring recycling. The expansion of purpose-built industrial facilities along the Thames, particularly in areas such as Greenwich, Woolwich, and Erith, typically included private waste management arrangements that prevented materials from reaching the public foreshore. Company records from firms such as Siemens Brothers, which established telegraph cable manufacturing works at Woolwich in the 1870s, show that industrial waste was increasingly managed through direct contracts with specialized disposal firms rather than being discharged into the river. Legal restrictions on foreshore access became increasingly common during the 1880s and 1890s. The Thames Conservancy Act of 1884 granted enhanced powers to river authorities to regulate activities along the foreshore, including provisions that could be used to restrict scavenging activities in the interest of navigation safety and commercial efficiency. Local authorities, empowered by various public health and nuisance prevention acts, began to view mudlarking activities as inconsistent with efforts to improve the sanitary condition and general appearance of waterfront areas. The London County Council, established in 1889, adopted policies that discouraged what official documents described as promiscuous scavenging along the Thames foreshore within the metropolitan area. Police records from this period indicate increasing enforcement efforts directed against mudlarks, particularly in central London areas where their activities were deemed incompatible with the capital's growing commercial and residential development. The Metropolitan Police Marine Division, established in 1878, included among its responsibilities the regulation of foreshore activities that might interfere with river traffic or compromise public order. Magistrates' court records from districts such as Thames, Suffolk, and Greenwich show a steady increase in prosecutions for trespassing, vagrancy, and related offences during the 1880s, with many cases involving individuals described as habitual scavengers of the river foreshore. Economic changes in the broader London labour market provided alternative employment opportunities that drew some individuals away from mudlarking activities. The expansion of manufacturing employment, particularly in industries such as engineering, chemical production, and food processing, offered more regular wages than the uncertain returns of foreshore scavenging. The growth of the service sector, including positions in retail establishments, transportation, and domestic service, created opportunities for steady employment that appealed particularly to younger people who might otherwise have engaged in mudlarking. Social investigators such as Charles Booth, whose comprehensive survey of London poverty was conducted during the 1886 to 1893 period, documented this transition from casual riverside occupations to more regular forms of employment among the working poor. The development of organised charity and poor relief systems during the late Victorian period also reduced the number of people who needed to resort to mudlarking for survival. The charity organisation Society, founded in 1869, coordinated relief efforts that provided alternatives to subsistence scavenging for many of London's poorest residents. Workhouse reforms implemented following the Local Government Act of 1894 improved conditions in institutional care, making formal poor relief a more acceptable alternative to independent survival strategies such as mudlarking. Records from institutions such as the Whitechapel Workhouse and the Greenwich Union Workhouse show increasing numbers of former casual labourers, including riverside scavengers, seeking institutional support during the 1890s. The consolidation of the scrap metal and marine stores trades during this period also affected the economic viability of small-scale mudlarking operations. Large firms such as Shapiro and Company and the London Waste Paper Company began to dominate the recycling trade, establishing direct relationships with industrial waste producers that bypassed the informal collection networks that had previously depended on individual scavengers. These companies operated their own collection systems and processing facilities, reducing their reliance on materials brought in by independent mudlarks and other casual collectors. Trade directories from the 1890s show a marked decrease in the number of small marine stores dealers who had traditionally purchased finds from mudlarks, with many either closing or being absorbed into larger commercial operations. Technological innovations in waste processing also reduced demand for the hand-sorted materials that mudlarks had traditionally provided. The development of magnetic separation techniques for iron recovery, improvements in paper pulping processes that could handle lower-grade waste paper, and advances in glass recycling that reduced dependence on carefully sorted fragments all contributed to decreased market value for the products of mudlarking activities. Industrial buyers increasingly preferred to deal with larger suppliers who could provide more consistent quantities and quality of recycled materials, making the small-scale offerings of individual mudlarks less economically attractive. By the 1890s, contemporary observers began to note the visible decline of mudlarking activities along the Thames. Social reformers such as General William Booth, founder of the Salvation Army, commented in his 1890 work, In Darkest England and the Way Out, on the decreasing numbers of people engaged in riverside scavenging compared to earlier decades. Journalists writing for publications such as the Pall Mall Gazette and the Daily Chronicle noted that the distinctive figures of mudlarks had become increasingly rare sights along central London's waterfront, particularly in areas that had been transformed by embankment construction and commercial development. Thank you for studying with the Sleep Scholar. May your dreams be filled with quiet knowledge. Sleep well, and we'll see you in the next lesson.